One thing we definitely know from the modern history of Russia is that political change, major political change in our country, happens like this. Suddenly, swiftly, and totally unexpectedly. This is how it's going to be the next time change comes to Russia. None of us knows when, none of us knows in exactly what circumstances. The only thing we do know is that change will come, because nothing is forever, and Mr. Putin is not going to be an exception.
Russia's violent war in Ukraine has set history in motion again. My name is Pisarska, and since 2022, I've seen my worst fears come true. With Putin's army invading Ukraine, never again happens again.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
The West has danced with the Russian bear for centuries, but it is we in Central Europe who've paid the price for living so close to an unpredictable neighbor. For 12 years, I've been organizing the Warsaw Security Forum, a platform for top-level politicians, the military, and the media to explore how we can live together in peace.
With this kind of terrain, we just have to shoot into everything.
Absolutely. Now, I'm taking you behind the closed doors of power as I meet my friends and allies who have helped shape our policy on Russia. And I ask, why has the West misread Vladimir Putin so badly? And is it ready to listen to Russia's neighbors now as we prepare for the worst-case scenario? In my journey around the globe, I also speak to the people who will live and die by these decisions. Welcome to my world.
It is now official. CNN projects that Donald Trump has been elected president.
Uważam, że Donald Trump chce zakończenie tej wojny jak najszybciej. Przepraszam, właśnie słyszę teraz alarm przeciwrakietowy. Bardzo przepraszam, muszę kończyć.
The price of the freedom always, in all history, very big. And practically always very tragic.
Kto ci powiedział, że żona i dziewczynki nie żyją?
Siostra.
After the US presidential election, Ukraine stands between a hammer and an anvil. Trump's unpredictable America on one side, Putin's Russia on the other. Since the full-scale invasion began, nearly 1 million people have fled Russia, the biggest wave of emigration since the 1917 revolution. Since 2004, I've watched the Putin's regime tighten its grip. NGOs closed down, journalists silenced, activists jailed or forced to exile, friends disappeared. Boris Nemtsov was shot down outside the Kremlin. Alexei Navalny left to die in prison. The message was clear: speak out and you will be silenced. And yet, even in exile, voices prevail. Faint, defiant, unbowed, still unwilling to be erased. This is the story of my longtime friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, resurrected from Siberian isolation.
Is it worth having a clear conscience? Is it worth not staying silent in the face of evil? I think yes. When I was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison by the Moscow City Court in April of 2023, my sentence said that I allowed myself hostile expressions directed at the senior leadership of the Russian Federation, including the President of the Russian Federation. Prosecutors under Putin are literally lifting phrases from NKVD documents of the 1930s and putting them in their indictments and sentences today. But this is what happens when you have a former KGB officer in power. I was constantly held in solitary confinement in a maximum security prison wing inside the prison. It was a cubicle-sized cell, 2 meters by 3. 4 walls, a small window under the ceiling with metal bars. The whole day, all I was able to do is basically walk around a small circle inside the cell. There is nothing to do. There is no one to speak to. There's nowhere to go. I was not allowed to call my wife or my children. That is another very Soviet practice when the regime seeks to punish not just the political opponents, but their families too. And I have to say that in these conditions, it is really easy to lose one's mind, because after a few weeks like this, your mind really starts playing tricks on you. You start forgetting even the simplest words. You start forgetting names. You start shouting at walls. You stop understanding the difference between what's real and what's imagined. And I was certain that I was going to die in that Siberian prison.
In Ankara, in the shadows of diplomacy, a deal was struck.
What happened on the 1st of August 2024, the largest East-West prisoner exchange since the times of the Cold War. The only way I can describe that as a miracle.
16 lives freed from Russia and Belarus, exchanged for 10, including spies and arms dealers, relics of another era, flown back to Moscow. But this was more than an exchange. Among those freed were American journalists, a former Marine, and Russians who returned not to safety, but to the front lines of consciousness. Among them, my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza, and others, Ilya Yashin, and Kevin Leak, now symbols of resistance, not just survivors of diplomacy. Today, in exile, in Berlin, they lead a fractured opposition, divided, cut off, limited in reach.
Сейчас будет, видимо, первый переворот. Да. Вот. И как раз вот вы можете видеть за моей спиной колонна как раз начинает движение. Я думаю, что мы можем сейчас пропустить и попробовать пообщаться с кем-нибудь из активистов, когда вот пройдет движение.
Who is here at this protest today?
There are very different people here, but we have one in common. We are against Putin, we are against this war, and it is very important to come to this process, because if people wouldn't talk about my case, I wouldn't be freed.
And what do you think is the current mood in Russia?
Of course, there are people that are opposing this war, but major part of the people are not active participants. They are silent and against the war.
Путин наказывает Украину за европейский выбор. И мы тоже часть Европы. И я призываю вас не погружаться в апатию, не сдаваться, не жалеть себя, а бороться за наше будущее и за то, чтобы Россия была свободной. Россия будет свободной! Россия будет свободной! Спасибо!
The protests rise amid fears that Donald Trump will strike a deal with Putin, abandon Ukraine, and throw the Russian opposition under the bus.
If you look at the history of any totalitarian country, but especially our own, the Soviet Union and now Russia under Putin, however harsh the repression is, however risky and dangerous it is to oppose the regime, you'll always find people who are ready and willing to do that, because they want to have a clear conscience.
Мы должны сказать «нет войне», мы должны сказать «хватит маразму», мы должны сказать «Россия и Украина без Путина».
On the 27th of February 2015, Boris Nemtsov, the leader of the Russian democratic opposition, who was the most effective, the most prominent, the most high-profile political opponent of the Putin regime, who was also my very close friend and mentor and godfather to my younger daughter, was gunned down with 5 bullets in the back, literally in front of the Kremlin in Moscow as he was crossing a bridge. This was the most high-profile political assassination in modern history of Russia. This is the price people pay in Russia for standing up to this regime. The same price was paid by Alexei Navalny, another very prominent opposition leader who was first poisoned by an FSB assassination squad, and then he was imprisoned and killed in prison in the Arctic Circle in February of 2024. This is the price of being a free person in an unfree country. Boris Nemtsov once said that freedom doesn't come cheap. It certainly doesn't in Russia under Vladimir Putin. Well, I'm very fortunate to be sitting here and speaking with you today because according to the plans of people in the Kremlin, this was obviously not supposed to happen. On 2 occasions, I was poisoned, lay in a coma with multiple organ failure on artificial life support.
The state is gangster, and it's led by a gangster, but it is a gangster state where the rule of law, truth doesn't apply, might is right, corruption is almost encouraged, and ultimately, what do you do with the gangsters? You put them in prison. So ultimately, we should build a wall around them and leave them to it.
When Putin launched his full-scale aggression against Ukraine in February of 2022, in the first days of the invasion, Putin's government criminalized any and all anti-war speech. So if you speak out against the war in Ukraine, that's a criminal offense. If you even refer to it as a war, that's a criminal offense, because of course in Kremlin propaganda speak, it's called, quote-unquote, special military operation. And yet, hardly a day goes by in Russia without reports of new protests against the war. And the fastest growing category on the political prisoner list in Russia today are the people who are speaking out against Putin's war in Ukraine. There were more politically motivated criminal convictions in Putin's 4th presidential term alone, that's between 2018 and 2024, than there were under the rule of Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev put together in the Soviet time.
Спасибо, что вы приходите. Спасибо, что вы поддерживаете. Спасибо, что вы здесь. За тех, кто сейчас в России и кого посадят в тюрьму, если они выйдут. Мы должны быть все вместе. Один за всех. И все за одного. Один за всех. И все за одного.
Юля, мы с тобой. Юля, мы с тобой. Россия будет свободной. Россия будет свободной.
The Russian political leaders in exile who oppose the Putin regime are incredibly courageous individuals. There's no questions about that. I think they're finding themselves in a really difficult moment because they can't organize, they can't change anything, they can't actually be a true domestic opposition. And I think this is the real challenge. When you don't know when an authoritarian state might fail. They do fail. But again, that can be in 1 year, that can be in 20 years. And in 20 years, if that's the timeline, who are going to be the people that are ready to go back? So I think they face a real challenge. How do you keep fighting on the outside for change on the inside?
Many people, especially in the West, especially in democratic countries, associate Russia and Russian history with something dark, something repressive, something totalitarian. But I think it's really important to remember that during all of these times, however dark it is, however repressive it is, you will always find people in Russia who are willing to stand up for what's right. And that makes me proud of my country.
2 years ago, you were thrown in prison. How old were you and why were you thrown in Russian prison?
I was 17 at the time and I was arrested in February 2023, 1 year after the beginning of the war. I was accused taking pictures of military complexes and give over the German intelligence services. Мы жили в Адыгее, в республике Адыгея, в Майкопе, и поехали в Адлер, потому что там работал аэропорт. И когда мы туда приехали, меня задержали где-то 7 сотрудников ФСБ. В конце 23-го года меня осудили к 4 годам за госизмену. И в начале июня, в конце июня меня перевели в Архангельскую область, в колонию общего режима.
Сколько вам было лет? How old were you?
Нет, мне тогда было 17, когда меня задержали.
Kevin's crime was taking pictures of this military base. The evidence against him: a broken telescope, a camera, and a laptop. Half German, half Russian, his very identity made him a suspect. So he became the youngest person in modern Russia ever charged with treason. Since the full-scale invasion, trust itself has vanished, upending thousands of lives. My friend, Zhanna, Boris Nemtsov's daughter, knows this better than anyone. Her story is like a movie: love, betrayal, and a spy who stole her heart to get closer to those she trusted most, Yashin and Navalny. The truth finally came to light at Moscow's Vnukovo airport.
Last year, there was a big prisoner swap between Russia and the West, and there was one guy that we've exchanged with Russia, Pablo Rubtsov. I think you know him.
Pablo Gonzalez or Pavel Rubtsov spied on me. He pretended to be a journalist from the Basque country. His Russian language was pretty fluent. I read his reports. I do not agree with a lot of things in those reports. But at least nothing, I think it's a good lesson for me and for everybody else. You should be very careful.
What about Alexei Navalny? Do you think he understood that going back to Russia, which it was his decision to go back to Russia, would cost him his life in a Russian prison?
There was one thing that he didn't know when he went back to Russia. He didn't know about the full-scale war against Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think that changed a lot. I just want to remind you, in 2021, Russia was not waging a full-scale war against Ukraine. And that was missing in his calculus.
So, Zhanna, I have to say, I had the immense pleasure to meet your late father many years ago, and I remember how shocked I was in 2015 when I found out of his death. What kind of price do people have to pay to oppose the regime?
Two key opposition figures, Alexei Navalny and my father Boris Nemtsov, they paid the ultimate price. Those people set very high moral standards for any society, because in many societies there are those few exceptionally courageous people who are ready to make an ultimate sacrifice for the sake of their values. And this is not in vain, because it keeps your society from complete moral decline. And those people, they are inspirational for future generations.
From the very beginning of Vladimir Putin's rule, more than a quarter of a century ago, it was absolutely clear which direction he was heading. It is a myth, often propagated for self-justification purposes by politicians and, policymakers both in Russia and in the West, that there was some kind of an early Putin who was different, who was committed to reform, to modernization, to cooperation with the West, and then supposedly, according to this myth, something went wrong along the way, and there's this bad Putin who's doing all these things today. This is a myth, this is a lie. Putin was Putin from the very beginning.
И сейчас я решил назвать человека, который, по моему мнению, способен консолидировать общество. Это секретарь Совета Безопасности директор ФСБ России Владимир Владимирович Путин.
It was only when Putin came in, the very end of 1999, the beginning of 2000, that people began to wonder what the direction of Russia would be. And for the first 6 or 7 years, there was good reason to think that Putin himself would join the experiment of signing up with the West.
Клянусь при осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации уважать и охранять права и свободы человека и гражданина. Я, конечно, буду иметь в виду и наш сегодняшний разговор, и вашу реакцию. Спасибо вам большое.
During the Warsaw Security Forum, I have dinner with Russia's most famous exiles. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, one of the richest men in Russia, who clashed with Putin and spent 10 years in a Siberian prison, and Garry Kasparov, a chess champion turned political opponent.
So, when was the first time you met Putin? Because you also met him personally.
No,
you never met him personally.
No. I met enough KGB colonels. So one more, one less doesn't matter.
Misha, when did you meet Putin first time?
После того, как он стал президентом, до этого я его не видел.
I mean, he came after Yeltsin, this young, unknown.
А когда я с ним встретился, да, он произвел абсолютно впечатление вот такого вот молодого, очень такого современного человека, и я подумал, а вдруг, так сказать, я ошибался, я как раз ребята правы, и, так сказать, вот надо, действительно, мы сможем с ним вести, ну, как бы нормальную работу, как уже положено, потому что все-таки Ельцин был царь, да, при всех, да, он был царь. Ну, вот уже, так сказать, у нас, как в нормальной стране, будет президент, с которым можно нормально работать.
I appreciate the fact that we've now laid the foundation for not only our governments, but future governments to work in a spirit of cooperation and a spirit of trust.
For those of us who grew up behind the Iron Curtain, the memory of life under communism is still raw. That's why Poland's joining NATO in 1999 was more than a political decision. It was a deeply felt escape, a final turn away from the bear.
I remember so well being in St. Petersburg in 2002 with George Bush. I was White House correspondent at the time. And on a beautiful June night, when the sun, you know, barely sets until 10 or 11 at night, we were floating down the Neva River. And during that trip down the Neva River, Bush and Putin talked about whether Russia might join the European Union and on what schedule. They talked about how Russia might eventually join NATO, the alliance created to contain the old Soviet Union. Seems unimaginable to us today, but that was, in fact, the major goal at the time, integration. There was such enthusiasm in those days, post-1989, that Russia and China later on, each for their own very different reasons, would join the West and join Western institutions.
When Putin took over from Yeltsin, when there was still, you know, the ideas of possible Westernization, do you think at that time anybody in Moscow was still thinking about integrating with the West?
I don't think Putin ever thought about full integration. And by the way, it was impossible because Russia's political and judicial system, the way business was, you know, was conducted in Russia was not ready for that. So I think if there any turning point where everything became very clear, though for me it was already predetermined, it's a Yukos case.
By the early 2000s, Khodorkovsky's old company, Yukos, was the jewel of Russia. Efficient, modern, profitable. Wall Street loved it. But the Kremlin did not. Putin warned oligarchs to stay out of politics. Khodorkovsky ignored him, backing the opposition, exposing corruption, and even hinting at selling Yukos to the West.
Michael wanted integration. That could be fundamental to make Russia part of this global financial, economic infrastructure. That could be unstoppable. Putin killed it. And by the way, it's instinct. He could smell that, the oligarch, Russian oligarch, would support him because they didn't want it. Because that means, integration means you're opening the books, you're subject to the same, the accounting principles. You'd better do business directly.
Он хотел больше, чем восстановить справедливость, даже пускай в понимании там части своего электората, сохранить вот этот вот политический контроль.
It was really a turning point, because it's a signal. What was tragic is that nobody in the West wanted to read the signal. So it's all about the trend, and the trend, from Yeltsin's years, you could see was going down.
Если мы посмотрим график путинской электоральной позиции, то мы увидим, что каждый раз, когда ему нужно было решить электоральную проблему, он начинал войну. Это было 4 раза. Была сначала чеченская, потом была грузинская, потом был Крым, и потом была, вот это вот масштабное вторжение. Он не захотел быть президентом всех россиян. Он сказал: окей, вот с этими каш не сваришь. Либералы, там, демократы, западники. У меня есть своя электоральная база. Вот что хочет эта база? Эта база хочет величия. Вот забрать Крым – это вот прямо вот. И не ошибся. Не ошибся.
There was no threat of the war for Germany or for America. It was business, pure business. So that's why it's much worse, because they just wanted to continue business as usual. Okay, there's sanctions, and what makes me really feel sick is that, did you hear Merkel apologizing or Obama going around? So they didn't say a word. The most powerful leader of the free world let it happen, and now it's the blood of Ukrainians. It's partial his conscience. No, he pretends he's just above the fray.
What will Russians see as a defeat? What has to happen in Ukraine? Crimea. Yes, it is Crimea.
Абсолютно. Путин для себя, может быть, он все сделал хорошо. Он получил возможность просидеть во власти еще, по крайней мере, 10 лет. Но с точки зрения интересов России он нанес ущерб. Вот это был предельный ущерб интересам России, который только можно было нанести.
I think the future of Crimea very much, decides the future of Russian Empire, because it's those who are trying to speculate on nostalgia about Crimea, they somehow believe that Russian Empire, as a mechanism, must preserve.
Polls show that the opposition has very little support among average Russians.
Обычно в России приблизительно 20-30% это проевропейская часть общества. Это очень важно понимать Западу, потому что, конечно, расчеты Запада на то, что удастся построить в России в ближайшие десятилетия, после Путина, такую вот европейскую демократическую Россию, вот это вот надо оставить в стороне.
You faced jail time. You were basically thrown out of Russia at some point, fearing your life. How do you do it? I mean, are you afraid?
Если ты об этом все время думаешь,
что случится?
То ты просто не можешь жить. Я хочу в какой-нибудь момент иметь возможность вернуться в Россию, пройтись по улицам Москвы и не переходить на другую сторону улицы, когда навстречу идут полицейские. Вот если это будет, то в целом
жизнь удалась.
Жизнь удалась.
In 1993, a Russian couple adopted a bear. They named him Stepan. He grew big, but remained tame, gentle, even playful. In a way, the West treated Russia the same way, feeding the bear with oil and gas money, believing it could live peacefully by our side. But Putin saw it differently. In 2014, he warned, the West doesn't want to live with the bear. It wants to chain it. Now, with Ukraine at war, the bear is no longer tame. For us in Central Europe living closest to it, the question is simple. Will the West finally stop the dance?
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
We shouldn't forget that Putin has been on a journey. You know, he started life as a so-called member of the family, the liberals, but on the end of the journey, and he doesn't even trust his own oligarchs now.
Now I'm in London, a city that became both refuge and showcase for wealthy Russians. Some chasing safety, others influence, and too often the West looked the other way as the money poured in and the crimes piled up.
I think some of the failures was greed. People wanted oligarchs' money. They wanted the property market. They wanted the money flowing into London and Paris and Berlin. And let's not ask too many questions.
Londongrad really was a phenomena about how Russian oligarchs in the late 1990s and early 2000s moved their money out of Russia.
We used to say that there was new and old money. Now there's nearly all new money.
So when the Russian oligarchs came here in 2000, 2001, the first thing to do obviously is buy property. And as I said, with people like Berezovsky, the more flamboyant, they would hire a helicopter and they would fly over London, and they would only choose certain areas of London to buy property. So Belgravia, Mayfair, Kensington, so that for them it was about their reputation. They didn't buy property as an investment. So they would pay, 50 million for a house that was worth 30 million, and they had so much money, and they didn't care. So the Londongrad phenomena became not just about hiding their money and keeping their money safe, it was a whole lifestyle thing as well, and they would buy art, and they just try and integrate into British society. Most of the British press were suspicious of the oligarchs, but then we had this situation where Alexander Lebedev, who was a former KGB officer, he bought the Evening Standard, and his son became the managing director of the Evening Standard, and then he got a peerage to become Lord Lebedev. So it's the ultimate thrill for any Russian moving here to get citizenship and become a lord.
I, Evgeny Lord Lebedev, do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors according to law.
So this is basically Eaton Square.
Yeah.
That used to be called?
It used to be called Red Square.
Why is that?
Because so many Russians bought property in this square, and it's traditionally the area where former prime ministers, politicians, wealthy businessmen bought houses and flats here because it's like the epicenter of the British establishment. They would see, a plaque of Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of this country in the late 1930s. So for them, it's like a status symbol. So they would buy a flat here or a house because then they feel they're accepted. They live where prime ministers used to live.
It's interesting because we're in this moment in time when actually Prime Minister Chamberlain's name is pronounced many times in the new context.
Yeah.
So he was the Prime Minister of UK just as the Second World War began. He was trying the policy of appeasement.
For many days, the statesmen who guide the destinies of our empire have been in anxious consultation over the crisis in Czechoslovakia.
This morning,
I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is a paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
1938, Britain learned the lesson, right? And if it wasn't for Winston Churchill, other members of my political party would have appeased Hitler. I remember being tutted at by half of Europeans for daring to say the first time round that there was a whiff of Munich about what was going on.
So this house is technically owned by Oleg Deripaska, one of the major oligarchs, very close to Putin. And he bought this house at the height of the Londongrad phenomena. It's very historic. 1920s, 1930s, it was owned by the Guinness family, and they had big parties where all the aristocrats and members of the royal family would come here. And then, as you can see, it's all boarded up because Ukrainian activists and other people got inside the house and put up pro-Ukraine banners and pretty much occupied the house. And so it's become a symbol, I think, of Londongrad, but also a symbol of the political opposition to Putin and the war in Ukraine.
You know how many Ukrainian people woke up and saw us and saw that London tear? And this is the reaction they get. You are giving Putin a propaganda tool. Look at you, armed and with shields, peaceful protesters. Shame on you, shame on you.
If the sanctions are released and he then owns the house, he could easily sell this for at least 35, 40 million, and then that money could go to Putin and it could help, the war effort. And I think that is a problem. And Deripaska is demonstrably close to Putin, and so I think it was perfectly justified that his assets have been frozen.
Well, the West's problem has it has been totally useless at understanding Russians. And it hasn't been prepared to listen to people that understand them. It has been a foreign policy failure of our institutions that should never be repeated again.
Great to see you. How are you?
Very good.
Thank you for finding the time. I really appreciate that. You've been on the topic of sanctioning Russia, not only the state, not only the government officials, but also the entire system, individuals who take part on every single level in the system. Do you feel that has been effective?
The idea of sanctions was, that there is a bad action and there's a potential consequence. And most people run their lives on the basis of risk-reward. And so if the reward is some kind of corruption and the risk is sanctions, some people won't do terrible things. And so I think sanctions, in a world without consequences, you put some consequences in, of course it has some impact. How could it not? Did it stop the war? No. But it certainly has, caused all sorts of pain to oligarchs and Putin and generals and government officials, and they hate them. I promise you, they hate these sanctions. That's their big hope is to lift the sanctions. I got 35 countries to pass the Magnitsky Act, which freezes the assets and bans the travel of Russian kleptocrats and kleptocrats from elsewhere.
It's an incredible achievement.
If one guy can do that, anybody can do that. I mean, it's, we all have a lot of, an individual can change the world, an individual can have an impact, and everybody should just try to do what they can do and not feel helpless and hopeless and so on, fight back.
Could you tell me about the Russian frozen assets in the West? Where are they and what are they really?
Putin, he actually didn't put that much money in America at the start of this war. He only had like 13 billion out of the 300 billion because he knew the Americans were tough. They were tougher.
And he left them in Europe, though.
Yeah, 200 billion in Europe because he thought the Europeans were weak. And it was a complete, absolute shock to him that when the war started, Europe froze that money. He was expecting more, resolutions and statements of outrage and nothing, because that's what he had enjoyed for the previous 20 years, 22 years, whenever he did something bad. And so it was a complete surprise to him.
So ironically, really, the frozen assets of the Russian central bank are the easiest for us.
By far, it's easy.
Confiscate, and they have a logical reason. We have a logical reason to do that.
There's an absolute legal basis to do it, and many of the best lawyers in the world have explained that to our governments, and our governments have all been just like timid and bureaucratic. You know, the politicians, it's all very straightforward. Russians did it, let's take their money. And then they throw it into the system, and then some lawyer raises his hand and said, well, there's this and that. And then it's too much trouble for them. They don't know the answer to the question. They can't argue with the lawyer, and so they just leave it be. That's how it's gone so far.
You know, we have a sanctions regime against Russia that the EU has to renew every 6 months, and so far that's been happening. Despite a lot of dissenting voices, we know who they are. Europe is not united in its view of the world. It's many countries, and some of those countries, like Hungary, are often obstacles to that European unity. But even Hungary has voted more or less with the European leadership and with the broader European view that Russia must be punished for its brutality and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the threat that it continues to present to the entire continent.
I hope until President Putin is out of the Kremlin that we will not be giving sanction relief to a state led by a war criminal.
What is the end game for the Russians when it comes to Trump and the negotiations right now?
I think they've achieved their end game. They don't want to give up on the war, but they want to reset their relations with America. They want to have the sanctions lifted. They want to.
But they haven't achieved that yet.
But they will. I mean, I think that's something that Trump can do unilaterally. Sanctions won't be lifted from Europe, but Americans can preemptively lift the sanctions, and I think that will happen.
How would you compare the importance of U.S. versus European sanctions for Russia? So if we are, in fact, in a situation in which only Europe continues to sanction Russia, does that still matter for Russia?
It matters. Well, I mean, it's all about the $300 billion right now. That's a place where...
Exactly. That's exactly what we're focusing on as well.
Well, thank God.
And what do you think we should do with the money? Because there's different concepts. Some are hesitant to just give them to Ukraine. Some are talking about a fund from which we could buy weapons.
Yeah, it should be a defense fund for Ukraine. And until Ukraine is safe, sovereign, and secure, we can't be talking about reconstruction. We'd be talking about
Absolutely.
defense.
So a defense fund from which we could buy European, but also American weapons. That could be a nice proposition for Donald Trump.
I mean, if he's cooperative, but if he's doing the stuff he's doing right now, it should be all European.
We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion. We gave you military equipment, and you men are brave, but they had to use our military.
What about West?
If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days. This is something.
Maybe less.
In 2 weeks, of course, yeah.
It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this.
America is now no longer an enemy. It's the best friend. If you watch Russian state TV, you know, Putin and Trump, biggest allies.
Trump's decided that the serial killer is allowed out on home leave. You know, I wouldn't be doing that.
Every U.S. president has tried to extend an olive branch to Putin and to the Russians, basically since the fall of the Soviet Union. I think at every turn, Democratic, Republican administrations, presidents have failed to do anything productive with the Russians for more than a brief period of time. So unfortunately, I think this is just the curse of American presidents, to come in, think they can strike a deal with Putin, and at the end of the day, they're left disappointed.
One of the things that we've been advocating as the Warsaw Security Forum is to confiscate the Russian frozen assets that are all around the West. What do you think about this?
I think Russia has to be held accountable for the crimes that it's perpetrating. So there has to be a way of holding them accountable, making them pay. And this is certainly one way to do it. The amount of money we'll need to reconstruct Ukraine is enormous. this is a perfectly feasible source to use some of it towards reconstruction in the future.
Olesya, how does it feel this time around? What are the moods here in London?
So it's the 3rd anniversary since the full-scale invasion, but it's 11 years since the war started. And it's a difficult moment in history at the moment because of the mood change in one of our main allies, the US, that we've observed over the last couple of weeks, really. It's disappointing to have to remind the world again that Russia is the aggressor. It's disappointing to find ourselves in a situation where our ally is engaging in victim blaming. And for me, it's particularly difficult because I keep listening to President Trump saying things like, well, if I had been president, this war wouldn't have happened. Actually, he was president in 2017, and the war was already ongoing. And that's when my brother was killed at the front. And this flag that I carry to all of the protests was on his coffin. So, you know, it's a shame that as well as fighting for our sovereignty and for our freedoms, basic freedoms, we also have to fight for our ability to defend ourselves, and still this narrative war still continues. It shouldn't be like that.
Thank you, Olesya.
Thank you, Katarzyna.
Gerojem Slava.
To hear it from a Pole means a lot. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Ukraine is bleeding every day. Russians, they are killing Ukrainians every day. Winston Churchill said, I quote, "War is bad, but slavery is even worse. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine at negotiation. We pay the highest price. Ukrainians pay the highest price with their lives. Slava Ukraini!"
Back in Poland, my message to lawmakers is simple. Russia must pay for its aggression. If negotiations will not result in just peace, if they will propose to Ukraine a settlement that at the end of the day is not acceptable for Ukraine, because it will mean losing sovereignty by Ukraine, the question to all of us here, Europeans, is, can we stand up there for Ukraine? And for me, the final really test is whether we will be able, for example, to confiscate Russia's frozen assets. Here in Warsaw, at the Security Forum, our fight continues to turn frozen Russian money into lifelines for Ukraine, so that one day it's not Europe, but Moscow that pays the price of this war.
Witam serdecznie, panie premierze. Cześć. Dziękuję serdecznie.
In this room we know very well that the holiday from history is over.
Pokój jest tylko incydentem pomiędzy stanem naturalnym, jakim są konflikty i wojny.
Russians never start at just one country. Europe also needs to move much faster on Russian assets.
We expected that Russia will be the part of some kind of free world. Never.
Behind closed doors, the forum is a testing ground for new ideas on how to stop Russia.
We want the war in Ukraine to end.
We must return initiative.
The reason that Putin can conduct this war is that he has money. He gets the money from the sale of oil. He sells between $200 and $300 billion worth of oil to China, India, and Turkey. So how do we get China, India, and Turkey to stop buying the oil? It's real simple. There's 9 oil refineries that buy the oil. If the United States, the European Union, the UK, Canada, and Japan were to jointly announce that these 9 refineries would be under international sanctions if they buy another drop of Russian oil, after a month or after 6 weeks, they wouldn't buy any more Russian oil. And if they didn't buy any more Russian oil, Putin wouldn't have $200 or $300 billion of money each year to fund the war. And in 6 months' time, he would come to the negotiating table. So that's my pitch for all of you decision makers here. I hope some people take it back to their parliaments and governments and so on. Thank you.
The
only way for Russia to have a chance for a change. The nation needs a shock. The best one is Ukrainian flag in Sevastopol. Because you have to eradicate the virus. The only way to actually tell people that it's time to start a new chapter in our history is to show that empire is dead.
The whole system has to be destroyed. You can't have this KGB dictatorship, whether it's Putin or his successors. The whole thing has to be discredited to such an extent that it gets rebuilt from the ground up.
The only way to ensure long-term peace, stability and security on the European continent, the only way to make Europe really whole, free and at peace is with a democratic Russia, is with a Russia that would have a legitimately elected democratic government that would respect the rights and freedoms of its own people and that would behave in a responsible and civilized fashion on the international stage. This is the only way. This is in all of our interests, and this is what our goal should be.
We should contain Russia. They can do whatever they like behind their walls or their fences, but we don't want their people and their money and their corruption. Thank you very much.
Now, the question is what happens next? Is it a Russia that becomes a democracy? Do all of these opposition leaders in exile go back? Or do we have another Putin-esque successor appointed?
We have no crystal ball. Trump's next move is uncertain.
We support your idea, and I want to discuss it, how to stop some countries from Europe, how to stop the possibility to buy Russian oil and gas.
Now we are all Russia's neighbors. Next time, I see up close how the Baltic states, from Estonia to Finland, live in the bear's shadow and how they have turned fear into readiness.
I think everybody has an enemy. And for Europe, that enemy is Russia.
And in Berlin, I ask, after decades of feeding the bear, can Germany face the truth and the threat from the East?